depends on the state. In Pennsylvania, they don't start counting, I understand, until the early vote until election day itself. So that's a large factor in frankly, the stringing out of the election results that you all were talking about before. But, you know, largely it depends on the state. But beware anybody trying to read anything into this. Just because there's a party registration shift that exists in Pennsylvania towards Republicans as much as anything else, that doesn't mean those people are all voting for one candidate or the other. And, you know, as Romaine just pointed out, too, you got a situation where just because there's registration advantages in one place or another, there's protest votes, special issues, all kinds of things.
Hey, Terry, we'll see you later this evening, sir. Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy. Looking forward to it, Terry. Thank you. Big takeaway from the conversation we just had. Romaine Bostick, Detroit, Michigan.
Yeah.
Not about the economy. It's about foreign policy.
And each individual group and how that is changing their decision to vote, who to vote for, whether to show up, and just how these people have been really catered to in that, what was it, $700 million of advertising that's been put in there by
Because why? In 2016, Hillary Clinton lost Michigan by 10,704 votes. If all of those voters that voted for Jill Stein decided to go for Hillary Clinton, she would have won the state.
Super small margins. That's what we're talking about. Super, super razor-thin margins, potentially going into this one. Coming up on the programme, Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan Asset Management as investors brace for election volatility. Equity futures right now up 0.1%. Bond yields bleeding just a little bit higher. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
We thought we'd take a look at Bitcoin versus the S&P 500.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
A tectonic shift emanating from Washington.
It's really a tale of two cities in crypto.
Crypto shouldn't be partisan.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Crypto VC is back.
And the technology.
It's really the beginning of a global on-chain economy.
And if America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be left behind.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech
spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your Super Bowl, right?
I can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg.
Good morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
taking you from the U.S. market's close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time, only on Bloomberg Television.
Here's a snapshot of things this morning. Good morning to you and welcome to the programme. Equity futures on the S&P up by 0.1%. On the Nasdaq 100 up by 0.2%. 2 hours away from the opening bell with your morning movers. Here's Manus Cranny. Hey, Manus.
Jonathan, a very good morning to you. There's an audible sigh of relief from Kelly Ortberg as 59% of the workers have agreed to a pay deal. So this closes off a 53-day strike. Now, this company is making 4 planes a month. That is 1 a week at the moment. So this is all about getting started up again. Can they get back to the low 20s on the 737 MAX? You have Michael O'Leary in the studio yesterday talking about the very holdback from Boeing is what's restraining his growth numbers. 38 is the magic number. That's on the 737. That's the maximum that they can produce. But this company's still going to lose money this year and the first half of next year. But it's relief at the moment. By the way, those workers go from 76,000 to 119,000. And the deal is going to cost Boeing about $1 to $2 billion. Palantir bid up this morning. Wow. I mean, Peter Thiel must be happy this morning. This is, in their words, unwavering demand for AI. Just think of the kind of companies. This is a huge government contract supplier delivering AI. Defense spending is the highest in 4 years with this company. Government contracts growth up 40% in the third quarter. And of course, they were included in the S&P in September time. So happy days for Palantir on the AI overlay on everything to do with government, defense, and any other company. Let's round it off with Wynn Resort. Yes, I love the line that you used this morning, which was, you know, Marriott might have a problem with the election in terms of people booking rooms, but when it comes to big betting in Las Vegas and Macau, I think this is a manifestation of China, the amount of stimulus, the amount of underperformance in Macau relative to the rest of the market. Earnings disappointed on sales. Earnings per share 90 cents, down from 99 cents a year ago and below the estimate. So you've got a little bit of pressure here. It's a different, I think, political story relative to Marriott. Jonathan,
yeah, you're right, Manus, and thank you for that. It's been a proxy to play stimulus hopes through. Wynn Resorts and other stocks like that.
So there is this bigger question. Is this actually just an excuse, or are there actually some people who are delaying their travels? It might be a little bit of both. I will just say from a business travel perspective, because it's not a big holiday time, if you travel, what do you tell your clients right now? Are you going to do fundraising? Because what project are you going to be having absolute conviction about? And if you're going to tell your clients your incredible analysis about who's going to win, we don't know. I mean, that's essentially what's going on.
Manus mentioned it again, so let's go back to it. The CFO over at Marriott International, a key measure of hotel demand, declining in November by double that of past election cycles. Is it just the election, or is it something else?
We'll find out in weeks and months to come. That said, I was just looking at some other quotes from big executives around corporate America. This is one from the CEO of Snap-on. Welcome to the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Nobody knows what's actually going to happen, so you can't even make a pronouncement. This from Etsy. The nonstop political noise is, quote, an incredibly distracting mindshare event. And even homebuilder D.R. Horton talking about how do you have conviction given some sort of big purchase if you don't know the path of the interest rates, nor nevertheless the backdrop for taxes and other big policy aspects.
A roll of dice if you want to lock in an interest rate right now. Under surveillance this morning, the U.S. presidential race on a knife's edge as Americans head to the polls today. Voters across 7 swing states likely to decide the election outcome. Harris and Trump delivering their closing arguments in dueling rallies last night in Pennsylvania and Michigan.
It's going to be a long night. It's going to be a long few days. I keep coming back to the fact that these election officials in Arizona are saying it could be 10 to 13 days. Jonathan, you're going through what happened in 2016. We knew relatively quickly, at least overnight by the morning, you knew what direction of travel policy was going to be going in Washington, D.C. 2020, it wasn't like that because of all these mail-in ballots. This year, more than 80 million people have already voted. So this election day is off to a pretty good start. If you talk to either campaign, all they'll keep telling you is it's all about turnout, but turnout where? Is it rural Americans or is it people in the big cities?
We've seen a ton of scenario analysis, and we always say you can learn something from the information you receive and you can learn something else from how the market responds to that information. Sometimes you don't find out how the market's going to receive any particular makeup of government until the night, the day after, the week after, the month after. 2016 is a classic example of just that.
I was just going to say, the poster child being 2016, because guess what? Everyone expected the market to tank, and it did the opposite. This time around, unclear how we're positioned, but people do think more of a Trump victory is baked into markets.
Let's get you some news elsewhere. Apple is exploring a push into smart glasses. Sources telling Bloomberg the company kicked off an internal study of products currently on the market last week. The research set to guide the company in what features it includes in its own glasses, as Meta makes a big effort here, right?
Yeah, but Meta's glasses are a little bit more expensive than the price point for this, which I believe is something like $299. It still is years away from it. I can just imagine my conversation with my kids later on when this becomes a thing. If I'm speaking to you, take off your glasses. I mean, honestly, how distracted are people going to be? Like, you know, are they looking at you or are they reading their texts? I just am trying to envision this world and exactly how people exist in it.
Those Meta Ray-Ban glasses, though, have now hit the Oprah Winfrey favorite things holiday gift guide. She says she's going to be giving them to people. She loves how you can wear them. Traveling, it could translate a menu from a foreign language into English, take pictures as you're walking through a new city. So I feel like Apple's now catching up to potentially what Meta's been seeing. I remember Ed Ludlow was talking about this is going to be one of the most transformational pieces of tech.
He was moved by it.
He was moved by those
Genuinely,
Ray-Ban glasses. And so was Oprah.
Apparently. Let's get to this final story. New York Times tech workers going on strike. 600 software developers and others who run the back-end systems behind the company's digital operations walking out just before Election Day. The two sides negotiated until Sunday and failed to come to an agreement. Talk about timing.
Yeah, and that's actually the comment from some of the executives over at the New York Times. Really, guys, it's disappointing that you choose this time. Of course, the tech workers say for their behalf, we've worked incredibly hard to try to lay the groundwork so that there will not be any disruptions. The key issue here is this comes at one of the highest volume times when everyone's pressing refresh, refresh, refresh. Do you have any potential victories to announce?
All night, and maybe for days, and possibly even weeks. Let's turn back to markets. Traders counting down to the US election and bracing for big swings on razor-thin margins. Kelsey Barrow of JP Morgan writing, price action has been choppy in recent days as investors look to manage positions before the elections. After elections, however, markets tend to refocus on the prevailing fundamentals. This is likely to be true again this year, with the exception being in a sweep outcome. Kelsey joins us for more. Kelsey, good morning.
Good morning.
Can we talk about that exception? Why would the sweep change things so much for you?
Well, essentially, there's a number of different things that we can focus on. There's the four key outcomes. You have divided Congress or divided government with Harris or Trump, and then you have the sweep outcomes. The sweep outcomes are where the market is going to be focused on a real shift in the fiscal trajectory that causes the Fed, that causes the markets to have to consider that the current path for the economy may be altered. So that's really the scenarios where I think that there is still a lot of uncertainty around how that path is going to be altered. In a divided government, I do think that we're going back to more of a status quo where we can refocus on the fundamentals, which is the way that we've been positioned all along. That's growth that's healthy, jobs that are slowing, wages that are moderating, inflation under control. Essentially, the expansion continues.
So take us inside your emergency playbook that you have out on your keyboard this evening as you watch the election results come in. Are you basically saying if you get divided government and signs of that, buy bonds? If you don't get divided government and you get some sort of sweep, then it's less clear, maybe sell, maybe don't have conviction. What sort of are the trades that you're looking for?
It's probably too simplistic to put it like that. So you have four outcomes that are the key outcomes, but talking to our colleagues, for instance, in Market Insights, David Kelly, their playbook has 10 different potential scenarios. So within those four scenarios, there's all of this gray area that we need to manage. And I think the key is with all this uncertainty is really not to get distracted and use this as an excuse to stay in cash. So our motto has been follow the alphabet, the ABCs, anything but cash. So don't use this kind of noise as an excuse to distract you from the opportunities that are out there within the financial markets and particularly within fixed income. We've had a remarkable trend of strong growth. Real final sales has been rock solid around 3%. Companies are doing well, and you can still build portfolios of bonds that yield 6 to 8% right now that we think are very well positioned for a variety of outcomes.
So you say anything but cash, but tonight cash is actually incredibly helpful because what a lot of people are looking for is potential dislocations in the market that they can take advantage of. How much are you looking to take advantage of specific dislocations? What are they that you are looking to go in and buy?
That is a good point. So we don't have any specific edge. I don't think anyone has any specific edge over these outcomes. But what we do have is setting ourselves up for flexibility to take advantage of anything that does become dislocated, particularly in the rate space, in the FX space. We've been looking at swap spreads, which have become very, very negative. That's a potential trade that has been focused on by hedge funds that are looking at the deficit moves. These are all things that we're looking at. And when I kind of take it back to, where should the 10-year yield be in a status quo scenario, one where we refocus on the fundamentals following the elections, based on the growth backdrop, based on the inflation backdrop, one that inflation is pretty close to 2, growth is healthy, but it's slowing. The Fed is cutting. They can continue to cut next year. I would say that's a 10-year yield around 3.5 to 4. Why are we not there now? I think it's pretty clear there's a decent amount of term premium in the market.
Take out the data, though. Where's the 10-year yield if Trump wins?
I think you could see a knee-jerk reaction that brings the 10-year yield significantly higher, 4.5, 4.75. But it also really depends on not just what happens with the presidency, but all of those gray areas. So not just the 4 scenarios, but the 10 different scenarios. And we also don't know what he's going to focus on in his first few days in office. He has talked about many different policy initiatives, but which ones will he prioritize first? Are they going to be the things that are growth positive, or are they going to be the things that are more focused on, foreign policy and inflation, which the tariffs raise prices, but they're also dampening on growth. So we need to understand what order of priorities either candidate is ultimately going to take if they win.
But the knee-jerk reaction for Trump could be higher yields. What's the knee-jerk reaction for Harris? Is it as low as where you think the 10-year should be trading at 3.5%?
So I think that you do see some trades that have already been put into the market that suggest that, if we were to see a Harris win, then you could see yields move a bit lower. But again, it really depends, refocusing back on the fundamentals. So to us, one of the most important things that we were watching last week was the jobs report, because I think there was a lot of uncertainty about if the labor market was actually reaccelerating here. And we were under the belief that no, the labor market actually is still cooling. That number in September is an outlier, and we're going to see it in the revisions. So what I've been doing is, when I look at the labor market data, I just look at everything through September. If you include October, I mean, you're creating an opportunity where you're likely to get whipsawed. But if you look through September, I think it's pretty clear. The labor market is still slowing, inflation is still cooling, wages are still moderating. That's generally an environment that's fairly good for fixed income.
This might be a short news conference on Thursday, don't you think? Sort of open it up, read the decision, close the book, thank you, head for the exits.
We cut by 25 basis points, nobody cares, go back to watching the elections. Cool,
thank you,
bye.
Goodbye.
Or every political question, there's going to be no comment.
No comment, no comment. Kelsey, it's good to see you. Good to catch up as always. Kelsey Barrow there of JP Morgan Asset Management. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Yum Brands saw its sales fall more than expected in the third quarter. Growth at Taco Bell failed to offset ongoing weakness at Pizza Hut and KFC. The fast food operators' overall comparable sales has declined 2%. KFC, for its part, posted a third straight quarterly decline. Taco Bell saw comparable sales rise 4%. Restaurant Brands, the owner of fast food chains Burger King and Popeyes, also missed sales expectations. Wells Fargo is set to begin the first ever contract negotiations between a big U.S. bank and unionized employees. The bargaining will happen today at a branch in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The location unionized last December, making it the first branch of a big U.S. bank to do so. So far, 22 Wells Fargo branches have joined the vote to unionize. The Cleveland Cavaliers are the last undefeated team in the Eastern Conference after they beat the conference worst Milwaukee Bucks last night. Darius Garland had 39 points with 7 three-pointers along with 8 assists for the Cavs. They currently hold a 1-game lead over the defending champs, the Boston Celtics. And in the Western Conference, the OKC Thunder improved to 7-0 after a dominant win over the Orlando Magic. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. We'll see you in about 30 minutes. Up next on the program, the final word.
4 years of Kamala have delivered nothing but economic hell for the American workers and the auto workers, all workers. Her inflation disaster has made life unaffordable.
Up next on the program, The View from the Trump campaign. Then 30 minutes later, we'll catch up with Mark Cuban for The View from the Harris campaign.
Do you think it'll be the case where someday you will be an investment committee or I'll be an investment committee and we just apply AI, decide whether it's a good deal or not, or we're not going to be there anytime soon?
I don't think we'll be there in the near term. And David, because, being on investment committees, there's the analytics of the math, there's the people, and then there's judgment. So analytics of the math, I think AI will help us get way more refined. Right now, we have analysts building models upon models. Our typical investment memo is 86 pages. So we could refine that down very, very seamlessly to pieces. The people aspect to it, to make a judgment call on, do I believe this entrepreneur is going to go the next mile? Do I believe that the background of the entrepreneur, who they are, what they stand for, their values, their family, that's the harder one. I think AI is going to take some time to get there. And then the final piece ends up being judgment. And I don't believe we've seen anything yet that gives us a sense of judgment that we're able to apply.
Jumpstart your trading day on Bloomberg Open Interest.
2 hours of single stock stories that are driving the opening bell action.
We'll take you to Wall Street, Main Street, the C-suite, and beyond.
These are companies that are growing their market.
The great companies in the U.S. are the companies hitting the cutting edge. That's a different story.
Get the inside track on what's buzzing in markets.
With the players who are shaping the narrative.
If you have bad earnings reports, you're going to get punished.
They're not buying what the industry is selling. Join us on Bloomberg Open Interest every trading day, only on Bloomberg.
Middle East and Africa. Vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizons Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insight from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
Equity futures up 0.1%. Bond yields higher by 4 basis points. The 10-year 4.32. Under surveillance this morning, the final word.
4 years of Kamala have delivered nothing but economic hell for the American workers and the auto workers, all workers. Her inflation disaster has made life unaffordable and cost families over $30,000 in higher prices. We've got to get the prices down, and we will. We will launch the most extraordinary economic boom the world has ever seen.
So here's the latest. Trump closing his campaign with promises for a better economy. Scott Besson of Key Square Group, a top economic advisor to the former president, telling the Financial Times if Trump wins the election, he won't weaken the dollar. Besson also defending Trump's pledges on tariffs, saying at the end of the day, he's a free trader. He's escalate to de-escalate. Scott Besson joins us now for more. Scott, welcome to the programme. And first of all, sir, thank you for being with us, because I know that rally wrapped up at gone 2 a.m. Eastern time. So you've only just landed, I believe, down in Florida. So, Scott, share with us. Here's my question for you and for Mark Cuban this morning when we catch up with Mark a little bit later. If you're an undecided voter this morning, waking up and you're going to the polls and you still just can't get there, Harris or Trump, what's your message to them?
Well, it's quite easy because the choices are quite stark. And we have a very unusual situation here because we've had a real-time experiment. We had a Trump presidency that delivered low inflation, the high real wage growth, and the, excuse me, good economic growth, especially for working Americans. Working Americans actually saw their household net worth increase more than the top percentiles. We also have an experiment with Vice President Harris and Joe Biden, where we had the highest inflation in 40 years. The bottom 50% of workers are getting crushed. I call it the 3 I's. Inflation, interest rates, and immigration. And if you want more of that, then you should vote for it. But it's a very unusual situation where both candidates have run policy.
Scott, when Trump left the White House, though, unemployment was at 6.4%. Today, it's at 4.1%. This is very low unemployment.
And Marie, that's a bit of sophistry. Is that was COVID. And you know it. Why don't we stop the clock at January 2020 and go from there? And it was one of the strongest economies ever.
So let's talk about some of the president's policies then. You say he's not going to weaken the dollar, but he gave an interview with Bloomberg Business Week, and he said the strong dollar is actually a problem. Why do you think he actually won't try to weaken it?
Well, I think that he believes it's a market reaction, and I also think he understands that tariffs have the excuse me, tariffs cause a stronger dollar. So a weaker dollar with tariffs is it's an economic abnormality. So I think we could see what's called the dollar smile, which you start out, right now we have high interest rates, high deficit. And if you were, and the still inflation above target, if you were to get inflation down to or below target through deregulation, through energy, then interest rates could come down and, you would have a market-based dollar depreciation. But, in terms of an overt weak dollar policy, I wouldn't expect that at all. And the other thing, too, if we go back to what's the pitch, and I'm very interested to hear Mark Cuban say this, because, I think what I find very odd with the Harris supporters, especially the Wall Street and billionaire class like Mark Cuban, the wink and the nod is, well, she's got these crazy policies, but the Republicans are going to have the Senate, so you don't have to worry about these policies going through. So if half of the Harris supporters are saying the reason to vote for her is because there'll be a Republican Senate, that's quite odd, where 100% of the people who are voting for Donald Trump today want a Republican trifecta. They want him to be able to implement all his policies. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation. I look forward to watching it.
Scott, but the Trump campaign says Kamala Harris stole some of his key proposals. So did they steal them, or is her proposals, what you're saying, are actually a little bit too crazy?
Well, I can tell you that the tax on unrealized capital gains, I've been doing this for 35 years, and I've done business in over 60 countries, and that is the worst idea that I've ever seen. It is a death spiral for markets, for capital, and when David Murphy decided in the presidential debate to 2-on-1 President Trump, and he said, oh no, Kamala Harris isn't a communist because a communist seizes the means of production. Taxing unrealized capital gains is seizing the means of production.
Scott, you raised a question.
She's walked back a lot of things And this is not one of the things she's walked back.
Yeah, Scott, you raised a lot of points here, and I think that one really interesting point is that one of the arguments that people make about Kamala Harris's policies is a lot of them won't go into effect. You could say the same thing about Donald Trump's policies, that a lot of the crazy ideas with the tariffs or potentially that could be destructive to growth won't go into effect, and as soon as he sees the stock market tank, he's going to reverse course. Is that true?
Well, but again, Lisa, that would be Donald Trump's decision. It would not be because he didn't want to. With Kamala Harris, it would just be because she's unable to do it. Let's look what she did when the Democrats had the trifecta. She was the tie-breaking vote on the Orwellian named Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan. $4 trillion of spending that set off the biggest inflation in 40 years. So if you want her to have the trifecta, have at it again.
Well, hold on a second. But Scott, a lot of people come around this table who are analysts and in the financial markets say that a red sweep with President Trump would cause inflation to go up, would cause bond yields to go up. That would be the most bearish situation for bonds. Are you disagreeing with that? I mean, essentially, that would be considered more inflationary, potentially, than anything that Kamala Harris could do.
Well, I think it's absurd to say that Donald Trump would be inflationary. If bond yields go up, they would be going up because there is a growth impetus, and the market would price in a higher growth trajectory. In my mind, it will not be because inflation will be going up.
Scott, it's good to hear from you. If you can stay awake for 30 minutes and watch the Mark Cuban interview, we look forward to your feedback. Thank you, sir. Looking forward to tonight. Scott Besson there of Key Square Group. Coming up in the next hour, we'll hear from Mark Cuban, a Harris donor, a minority owner of the Dallas Mavericks. That conversation in about 30 minutes.
Be interesting to see what Mark Cuban has to say, especially since he has been out and about supporting her every single day. He's almost like the Elon Musk because he's a donor, because he's a billionaire, except he's a little bit less, jumping off on
Where's
stage.
Where's his $1 million a day giveaway? Where's his?
Oh, is that what you're going to ask him? Are you going to open that up?
That's what I want to know.
Why aren't you giving people $1 million to sign up for the right to vote for
money?
arms?
Where your mouth is. All that
Is
stuff.
that what that is? That's what that's called.
Is it a lottery or is it a job?
Still don't know. The judges decided it's one and not the other, so there you go. Coming up on the programme, Cameron Dawson of New Edge Wealth, Neil Dutter of Renmac, Dallas Mavericks minority owner Mark Cuban, and our team covering the Trump and Harris campaigns. From New York, the third hour of Bloomberg Surveillance. Up next.
In terms of how we should deal with the challenges that are, facing the world and also internally, I think it's just an opportunity also, an angle. And you could see that in a lot of activities that are picking up in this region, simply because it's a region that is actually a bright spot amongst very few in the world today. And people always talk about the flavor of the month. Actually, I don't want to sound too, large-headed, but actually we will be the flavor of decades. We are determined, we have long-term plans, and we are very clear and committed on our commitment to the investment community at large. I'm not talking about one individual country, but at large in the GCC, that we mean business, that we are willing to take every step possible to make it easier for investors to do business in the region, that we are willing to do a lot of structural changes, including actually making it very predictable, very consistent policies.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, The China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, The China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
What about artificial intelligence? Is artificial intelligence going to enable you and others to say, we have enough information to know exactly what something is going to be worth in terms of insuring it or not?
Artificial intelligence is finding its way into our business in a variety of different factors. I think the first piece is getting much better insight into data, which allows us to make better decisions on underwriting. It's also a great opportunity to service business better in terms of like call centers and different ways of what's using robotics and other AI will be very helpful. But it is an emerging practice within the industry and one that is evolving very quickly. So it's also going to present risks that other companies, how they use it and how they use large language models and making sure the decision making is very sound. So it's complicated, but it definitely is benefiting the business today.
It's the countdown to the market open as we bring you the first trades across Europe.
We'll debate the most important stories and what will drive the big investment decisions throughout the morning. I'm Guy Johnson.
I'm Kriti Gupta.
And I'm Anna Edwards. Join us every weekday morning for the opening trade, live at 7 a.m. here in London.
Only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
There is a very bearish setup of the investors going into the election day.
As the presidential race goes, probably those Senate races go.
The polls are razor thin in the states that matter, in the communities that matter.
There's a very big difference between what voters in the swing states feel are important issues.
There's a lot of conflicting signals, most of which are showing this to be a tie or toss-up race.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
90 minutes away from the opening bell, your scores look like this on the S&P 500 across the equity board. Elevated just a touch on S&P 500 futures up by 0.2%. On the Nasdaq 100 up by a third. In the bond market, big start to the week for fixed income, big rally through this bond curve. The 2-year bounces back, yields up by 3 basis points to 4.19. On a 10-year up by 4 to 4.32.51. Mike Wilson of Morgan Stanley on this program yesterday said that this would be a market clearing event, that we could get up to 6K on the S&P 500. Is it that, or is it a defining event for the next 12, 24 months?
It depends on what the outcome is. It seems like the bar is high or low, depending on who you talk to, for something that could truly be formative. Ultimately, though, it doesn't come into who's at the top of the ticket, and I feel like I'm just basically parroting everything that you're about to say or have been saying, which is it really has to do with the composition of Congress, and as we heard from Kelsey Barrow, basically the gray details that we have to parse throughout the night.
The composition of Congress is really important for things like tax cuts, to make sure that we don't blow through the debt ceiling, which is going to be a fight starting January 1, 2025. When it comes to tariffs, that is where actually the executive branch can act alone. Not on everything, because there is some legal precedent, potentially how big the wall potentially could go up. They would need Congress's backing. But that is the one area where if Trump wins, he can do that unilaterally on day one.
That's why you have to split up these trades. There are tariff trades, think dollar mex, and then there are basically bond market trades, tax cut trades, higher yields. Think about what this could mean for the Federal Reserve. There's a lot on the table for the next 12 months.
Yeah, especially at a time where either candidate is going to expand the deficit. You look at the ranges, some of the nonpartisan projections have the base case for Donald Trump raising the fiscal deficit over the next 4 years to by $7.7 trillion. Kamala Harris is only $3.7 trillion. Nonetheless, what you're talking about is a much deeper deficit at a time where there is no attention spent right now, paid attention to just in terms of how you offset this and create a more fiscal and plausible future.
I go back to what Mohamed El-Erian wrote in the Financial Times this morning. He's like, these election promises do not mean they're going to be policy. Look at the tax cuts that just this election cycle has introduced. Corporate tax rate, 15%, 28%, red or below. No tax on tips. Everyone seems to agree on that. Social Security exemption, extend the 2017, all of those tax cuts, $5,000 tax credit, consider eliminating federal tax incomes for first responders. Harris, expand the child tax credit, increase corporate tax rate, increase capital gains tax, proposal to provide $25,000 if you're buying a new home. Is any of this really going to happen?
I think we're all exhausted by all of this, aren't we? It's gone on for months and months and months. We've had assassination attempts, a last-minute candidate change. Over the last 2 months, we're all trying to get our hands around fresh policy coming from Harris, who's trying to redefine herself away from the person we knew back in 2019. And once you've got through all of that, can you imagine being in Pennsylvania and you face down $1.2 billion worth of ad spend from these two campaigns over the last few months? Those numbers are incredible.
Which means that people are really sick of hearing them, but they also feel a little bit more political urgency, as we heard from David Gura down there. What I thought was interesting is the corollary, the knock-on effects. 1-800-Flowers came out and said, media is more expensive. The election does have a big, big impact on what we pay for things, both digitally and in traditional media.
Can't advertise.
You can't advertise because how can you go up against that incredible wash of money?
Getting crowded out over the last few months. Do you think that's why Marriott are seeing spend on hotels coming down?
Because they're not able to advertise in Pennsylvania and in Michigan.
Futures on the S&P up by 0.2%. Coming up this hour, Cameron Dawson of New Edge on the election boogeyman that could spook markets. Neil Dutta of Renmac following US economic data. And we'll catch up with the Dallas Mavericks minority owner, Mark Cuban, making the case for Kamala Harris. We begin this hour with stocks on hold on the last day of voting in America. Cameron Dawson of New Edge writes the following. Given how tight polls and odds are, we see the election as a source of near-term volatility, regardless of the result. Each side has boogeymen that could spook markets. Cameron joins us now to talk about those men. Cameron, who are those men?
Well, those men certainly are things like higher deficits, higher corporate taxes, tariffs, and immigration. And I think Anne-Marie's point was really important, is that if we think of the tariffs line of things, it doesn't necessarily matter about the makeup of Congress, that we could see them if Trump is elected, which is certainly some of the questions that you've seen raised by the bond market and considering potentially stickier inflation. So we think regardless of who wins tonight or whenever we get those results, it effectively is going to be a surprise because those polls are so very tight, which means that it could be a volatility-inducing event. I think it's important to note, though, that markets aren't necessarily primed for volatility to continue. You've seen a huge buying of put options for the VIX, effectively people betting on volatility collapsing post the election. So again, this could simply be a surprise, and it could cause that higher volatility, given the fact that people aren't necessarily positioned for it.
I want to pick up on that point because you see this across a range of different volatility metrics. Basically, people expect volatility price swings to really peak tomorrow and then absolutely fade off as we get results and go back to some sort of status quo. From your vantage point, how much are you looking to actually take advantage of something that could be more significant? How offsides would this market be? And what would you do with that?
We always try to see volatility as opportunity, and I'd raise the question of if we would be seeing this volatility, even if this wasn't election day. If you look at things like S&P 500 momentum and breadth, they've all been deteriorating over the last month. You've also seen a deterioration in forward earnings estimates. You've seen estimates for 4Q as well as 2025 get cut and trimmed. So I would raise the question of if we could have this volatility, even if this was not election day, simply because you have a lot of digestion of the strong gains that we've had year to date and kind of putting some of the seasonality aside, given that deterioration in breadth and momentum, that just sets you up for a little bit more churn.
At this point, Cameron, you have to understand, I have to understand, and I don't understand exactly how much we've already priced in some of these trades, what these trades actually are. I'm thinking in particular in the bond market. People have been wondering, you strip out the political influence, what does the 10-year yield look like? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, we do know that there has been a relationship, whether it's correlation, causation is up for debate, between Trump's odds of winning and the 10-year Treasury yield over the last 3 months or so. That certainly broke down at the end of last week, where Trump's betting odds started to fall and you still saw the 10-year Treasury yield moving higher. We think the source of that 10-year Treasury yield moving higher really comes down to the bond market digesting the fact that you have a relatively resilient economy that is supported by higher deficit spending at the same time as you have a Fed that's talking about potentially hundreds of basis points of cuts to get to their idea of neutral, which could have the potential of effectively throwing lighter fluid on some of this tightness within the economy, the fact that you still have overall easy financial conditions as well. And that seems to be the reason why you're seeing these bond yields move higher, not necessarily the election or just the election.
The why is important, Cameron. The why is important because I think it dictates how to trade equities, to some extent at least. Would you say yields have been rising then for good reasons and not bad? And is it a reason to stay long equity markets?
I think the answer to that is in high yield spreads. If yields were rising for bad reasons, that the Fed was tightening policy and it would eventually result in much weaker growth, you would see high yield spreads widening out. But they continue to remain very contained and actually making new year-to-date lows, which says to us this is not a market that is necessarily in fear of growth. It's not priced for a growth slowdown. Now, you could see that as a risk going into 2025 if you start to see a deterioration in economic fundamentals. But effectively, the credit market is telling you that yields are rising because growth is resilient. So watch those high-yield spreads very closely.
Would you expect it to remain that way even if we got a sweep from the GOP in the next 24 hours?
I don't necessarily know if any of the policies that would be enacted by a GOP sweep would necessarily affect growth in 2025. Let's put tariffs and potentially immigration to a side, because that is certainly something we could see without a GOP sweep. But the question and the risk for a GOP sweep really is something that's contemplated later in 25 and into 26, where we will be negotiating those $4 trillion of tax cuts, potentially adding a lot to the deficit, which is certainly something that the bond markets might push back on, but that's not necessarily something that we deal with in the next couple of months.
Cameron, a couple of months ago, people who came on this show talked a lot about how this could be a transformative event, how this could mark the difference in an economic cycle with respect to inflation, with respect to growth. As we've gotten closer to the event, people have revised that view. Suddenly, people are saying, actually, we just need to get past it, and whatever the result, things will keep on going on the way they were before. Where do you fall on that?
The best news that we always try to bring clients back to is that if you look historically, that the S&P 500, regardless of the power balance within DC, has been able to do what it does despite of or in spite of what goes on in DC. And that's really good news, which just means that overall corporate earnings have been able to operate in times regardless of uncertainty and pressures of what's going on within policy. And it's something that we always try to remind clients of, just so that the way that they don't respond too emotionally to what is, for many people, a very emotional election day.
Cameron, we know the markets like certainty. What if it is a contested election? What's going to be the impact?
Certainly, that would be potentially a source of volatility. It's not necessarily volatility that would last for a long time. So it gets back to Jonathan's first question of, if you do see volatility, is it viable? We think the answer is yes, that as you start to digest some of these deteriorations in breadth and momentum that could be happening regardless of the election, you get the narrative of uncertainty behind it, then you set up for effectively a great buying opportunity into year end with that potential Santa Claus rally and year end chase. So a source of volatility, not necessarily a source of investment decision.
A good framework for thinking about this market into year end and beyond. Cameron, thank you. Cameron Dawson there of New Edge Wealth. If you are just joining us, bond yields higher at the moment, up by 4 basis points now, Lisa, approaching 4.33. So tapering back some of that rally from yesterday.
Basically, nobody knows anything, and basically people are trying to de-risk and then re-risk. And what you can see, maybe this tracks the predicted odds or some of the other prediction markets odds that do show Trump once again gaining a slight edge. Other people say that these markets are completely skewed and don't listen to them at all. I will just say this. I do think it's important to take notice of that auction yesterday. It was a messy one, and it was a 3-year note auction. We've got a 10-year one today, a 30-year one tomorrow. Supply is going to be harder to digest in a time of incredible uncertainty.
What's that Spider-Man meme when they're sort of looking at each other and doing that? Do you know that one?
I do, but I don't really know.
Okay,
yeah,
never mind, Lisa.
But that's
Equity futures positive, up by a little bit on the S&P. We'll park that. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning with your Bloomberg brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Boeing employees have voted to accept a new labor contract
bringing to an end a crippling 7-week strike. Nearly 60% of workers voted in favor of the new deal. It will see wages increase by 38% over 4 years and enhanced retirement contributions. Hourly workers start returning to factories in several states as soon as Wednesday. The breakthrough marks a big win for the new CEO, Kelly Ortberg, as he aims to rebuild the company's culture and improve the quality of work in its factories. Goldman Sachs will add the most executives to its partnership program in the era of David Solomon. The promotions will be announced this week, and people familiar tell us that they will exceed the prior high of Solomon's 80 people in 2022. It's a big shift for the chief executive, who had preferred a smaller partner class to reinforce the aspirational nature of the rank. This time, Goldman had to both replenish its pool of partners who've left and is enjoying a spell of performance breakout. Monday evening, Joe Rogan announced his endorsement for former President Trump. In a post on X, the popular podcaster praised the, quote, great and powerful Elon Musk, saying he made the most compelling case for Trump you'll ever hear. The endorsement could offer a boost to the Trump campaign, given Rogan's popularity among young men, a key voter demographic for the candidate. And that's your brief. John.
Danny, thank you. When we look back at everything, when all is said and done, I do wonder if we'll look back at that as a big missed opportunity for Kamala Harris to sit down with Joe Rogan.
She had to go to his studio, which was part of the problem, and their election scheduling, but she chose to go at SNL. And if you're watching SNL, which is definitely more old school, less new age, you're probably voting for her. Joe Rogan would have put her in front of 15 million men. And this is a source that actually she needs to shore up.
We'll see if we're talking about this tomorrow morning or not. Up next on the program, the Morning Calls Plus, we'll go to the critical swing states of Georgia and North Carolina. That's all around the corner. Up next, after the commercial break, this is Bloomberg.
Key investors, top executives, global innovators. Join me for in-depth conversations with the biggest newsmakers on the day's top stories. Insight with Haslinda Onen, only on Bloomberg.
David Weston. Join me for the next generation of Wall Street Week, telling stories of capitalism from business, markets, economics, tech, and climate. Each week, we'll go on the road for a look at what lies behind the headlines of today and what will likely be the headlines tomorrow.
Above all else, it's a mission.
It's done nothing but grow immensely. To me, that's an extraordinary sign.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Watch the all-new Wall Street Week.
More than what you need to know, it's what you need to think about.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street.
We are basically deep in the European earnings season. Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
The opening about 1 hour and 13 minutes away. Equity futures on the S&P up by 0.1%. In the bond market, yields higher by 4 or 5 basis points. The 10-year 4.33. Let's get you some morning calls. First up, Wedbush raising its price target on Palantir to 57, highlighting its robust quarter and accelerated deal momentum. Your second call from Bernstein, upgrading eBay to outperform, saying the recent pullback in shares offers a better entry point. That stock is up by 1.5%. And finally, JP Morgan raising its price target on Dollar Tree to 82, emphasizing its commitment to a formal review of strategic alternatives for Family Dollar. That stock is up by 4%. Let's turn back to the election with two battleground states in focus. We've got team coverage with Bloomberg's Brett Pulley in Atlanta, Georgia, and Anna Edgerton in Raleigh, North Carolina. Let's get to you first, Anna. Can you walk us through how well things are turning out in North Carolina, just in terms of the process, given how hurricane hit the western part of the state was only a month or so ago?
Yeah, we've actually seen remarkable turnout in those western states that were devastated by Hurricane Helene. Of the 25 counties that were impacted, only 3 had turnout rates in early voting that were below the state average. Across the state, we see Republicans and Democrats taking a really different strategy to their ground game. Republicans have focused much more on community, on their grassroots activists, saying that they have more trust from their friends and family to get out and convince them to vote for Donald Trump. Democrats have a really impressive army of volunteers here. They say they've had 45,000 people sign up to volunteer since Kamala Harris became the nominee. And those volunteers, they said, have knocked on 1.7 million doors across the state. I talked to 2 of those volunteers yesterday, and they said they're still finding undecided voters. And they are able to talk to them about Kamala Harris, tell them about her as a candidate, and encourage them to get out and vote today. We're going to look and see the turnout from both parties and that really crucial block of unaffiliated voters here in North Carolina.
Brett, let's bring you in. In 2020, Biden became the first Democrat to win Georgia since Bill Clinton in 1992. What does the ground game look like in this crucial state for both camps?
Well, both of the candidates have certainly focused a lot here in Georgia. They closed out on Sunday former President Trump in Macon and Kamala Harris in Atlanta, and that was those were both one of many, many appearances. You know, it's unusually foggy and low visibility here in Atlanta today, which of course is Georgia's largest city. But it seems that one thing that voters, I think, across Georgia can certainly see is an end in sight to what has really been a tumultuous campaign, especially here in this state. It feels like, as you alluded to, it's been going on since 2020. Of course, this is a place where the former president committed the alleged crime of asking to find more votes, and this is also where President Biden was like a deer in the proverbial headlights during the debate, which led to Kamala Harris being on the top of the ticket. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger said yesterday that people in the state have already voted in tremendous numbers, over 4 million people during early voting, another 1.1 million expected today, and it should be interesting.
So when will we find the results, Brett, of Georgia? Because, of course, we all remember the recount that took place. When will we get the final results from this state?
Well, look, 80% of the counties are required. They say about 80% will have their votes into the Secretary of State's office within 1 hour after the polls close this evening at 7 p.m. And so it looks like the votes will come in. The big question is, to what extent will it be contended? There are a lot of things that have been put in place by the state's election board, which is mostly Republican controlled as of recently. That could lead to potential challenges. There have been legal challenges in the courts in recent days. Yesterday, the Republican Party won a challenge asking that relatively, I think, small number of votes not be counted because they were absentee ballots that will not get back in time, that were actually mailed out too late as a result of problems within that county. So there are all kinds of things kind of hanging in the balance that, depending upon the outcome, could make it a long time before we know.
And we are being prepared for that and hunkering down for that. Anna, from your vantage point in North Carolina, it's a state that Donald Trump has gone to a number of times, repeatedly over the past few weeks. I'm just curious what you're watching. Is it the suburbs? Is it the urban areas? Are there specific sectors? What intel are you hearing on the ground?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point because this was the only swing state that Donald Trump won in 2020, although it was his most narrow victory. And so the fact that he has spent so much time here, 2 rallies on Saturday, 1 on Sunday, another one yesterday, shows that his campaign is not taking anything for granted. We will be looking at those ring counties around around metro areas, these suburban counties that have changed a lot since the 2020 election. There have been hundreds of thousands of people moving to the state, registering to vote. And so the big question is whether they're going to vote more like the rural counties they used to be or more like the suburban counties they're quickly becoming. So that's going to be really important. Also watching Republican turnout today. Republicans had a really strong showing in early voting. And the question is whether or not those are people who would have voted anyway today or if Donald Trump is converting new voters to his cause in his campaign this year.
I think we all know someone who's moved to North Carolina in the last 12 months. I know several people.
Do you
Anna,
really?
thank you. Yeah, really. Anna Edgerton, Brett Pulley, to the two of you, thank you. I'm pleased Brett brought up the debate back in July. I just imagine, and I can't get into the heads of people, none of us can, of course, although some of you claim to, but I can't. If Biden and Trump agree on one thing, it's that they wish they never did that debate back in July, for sure.
And if Harris wins, the Trump campaign is going to look at the potential errors along the course, and that would be number one. Why did they agree to this debate before the RNC, before the DNC? Because can you imagine that debate was in September or October before this election? Biden's poll numbers fell off a cliff. The donors were calling and saying there needs to be a change. Speaker Pelosi basically said, we're still waiting for your decision. Until it's the right decision, we're not going to accept it. That debate was seismic for this election cycle because it meant they're no longer the incumbent president was at the top of the ticket, and it brought in Kamala Harris, who then had to re-identify herself, but also it brought fresh enthusiasm and a ton more money. We're talking about all this ad money in Pennsylvania, across the swing states, $1.8 billion, is it? Well, guess what? All of that fresh money was coming because of that change, because of that debate.
They were most passionate about the golf game. I can just imagine if they had really continued on that vein, if it had been those two candidates, we'd hear a lot about, no, you don't have that bogey, give me a break. I mean, we'd hear a lot of that, I think, coming out of the campaign. And instead, it's a little bit different. I will just say, it does highlight how topsy-turvy this entire campaign season has been.
Hasn't Donald Trump been going after Mark Cuban's golf game as well?
It's a very sensitive point, I hear.
Very sensitive, low club head speed, apparently.
Are we going to ask him about that? Is how you going to open it up? Do you have a low head?
Just absolutely ridiculous, the whole thing has been. We have got some economic data for you in about 5 minutes' time. We've got the trade balance a little bit later this morning. And then later on at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, some important data, ISM services for the month of October. I know a lot of this is being overlooked this month for obvious reasons, but that's an important data point this week.
Yeah, big question about whether you can continue with the expansion, and kind of to the point that Kelsey Barrow was making, are we slowing down? Is this an economy, if you take a look at the averages, that actually is losing a bit of its momentum? I love this quote. I have to just read it to you.
Sure.
From Jason Thomas over at Carlisle. Like a tree falling in the woods when there's no one there to hear it. The Fed convenes this week for the second to last FOMC meeting of the year. There is economic data. There are things that we otherwise would be focusing on. We will be covering it all, but no one seems to be.
We'll have special coverage of Fed Decision Day.
We will.
Right here on Thursday. I might have to change ties, but I'll still be here. Same suit, everything. Not leaving.
This will be fun.
In the next 30 minutes, Neil Data of Renmac, and we'll catch up with the Dallas Mavericks minority owner, Mark Cuban from New York. This is Bloomberg.
From our studios in New York and San Francisco, our expert hosts have the data and analysis about the companies you know and the startups to watch, plus the interviews you don't want to miss. Watch Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow on Bloomberg Technology, the only daily business show dedicated to tech, right in the middle of the trading action, every weekday, only on Bloomberg Television. Context changes everything.
As we spend some time here on the broader presidential race.
Let's focus in on European politics.
Makes you wonder how politics might play out.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything. The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings stick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have take two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Economic data drops in about 20 seconds' time. Equity futures going into that positive by 0.2%, up by a third on the Nasdaq 100. In the bond market, big move to start the week. Big rally. Treasury yields aggressively lower across the curve. We bounce back a little bit right now. We're up by 4 basis points. The 10-year 432.72, up 3 at the front end of the curve. The 2-year up to 419.10. Around the table with us, Mike McKee with some breaking economic data. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning. Economic data back in the news. Who'd have thought it? I mean, but Thursday, reminder, we get the Fed again. $84.4 billion for the trade deficit, which is just a little bit higher than anticipated. 84 flat was the survey number. 70.8 is the revised prior month. Now, we basically knew these numbers because they give us the advance, but it does tell you a reason why growth was a little bit slower than had been anticipated. This took some of the growth out of the United States, but it is going to be interesting for the Fed on Thursday because we're going to be asking about this, and we're going to be asking, well, if we don't know the winner, and if the winner is not Harris, then we're going to be asking about tariffs. The Fed did model in 2018 what would happen with tariffs because Trump was putting tariffs on at the time. They predicted it. Inflation jumps, consumer spending falls, business spending falls, markets go down because lower earnings is in prospect. So they could either their model said we could either raise rates to deal with the higher inflation, and that would probably lead to recession, or we could look through it and hope that the inflation is short-lived. And if it's not, then we got to raise rates anyway. So it's a tough dilemma for them. And they don't. This was a staff forecast.
Yeah.
They don't know what they would do, and they don't know how bad it would be, but it wouldn't be a good thing.
You'll be there on Thursday. Mike McKee, let's bring in Neil Dutter of Renmac to weigh in on some of the economic data we've seen. And Neil, look ahead to that Federal Reserve decision on Thursday. How straightforward is this for the Federal Reserve on Thursday? And does it get harder in December?
Well, in my opinion, no, it does not. I mean, I think we should expect rate cuts at each of the next 2 meetings. And I think 25 basis points is a lock. My only thing to say about December is at the moment, the markets are priced about 20% for a skip. I think that could shift a little bit towards, I think the left side of the distribution, meaning, I wouldn't be surprised for the markets to start pricing in a 50 basis point cut in December. I'm not saying that's what they will end up doing, but I think in terms of distribution of probabilities, cutting more is more likely than not cutting at all. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it. The labor markets are clearly slowing.
Neil, do you feel like this economy is kind of on a path that right now is not going to get disrupted by the election joy that we've been experiencing? Or do you think that this really is a decisive moment that could alter that economic trajectory?
I mean, in my career, I just tend to tune out the political noise. I mean, yes, things can change in terms of fiscal policy, but I think it's not wise for the Fed to sort of front run these potential outcomes. I know there's been a lot of ink spilled on the so-called Trump trade in the financial markets, right? This idea that, the sort of tax cut extension, tariffs, less immigration will push up dollar and bond yields and so forth. But, I think it's important just to kind of take a step back, think about, the sort of sequencing of events here. I mean, if you go back to the first time he was in office, tariffs were actually the first thing that was happening. I mean, the first thing that was happening was very market-friendly type stuff, right? Like deregulation and tax cuts and no matter what happens, I think the markets seem to be saying more of a chance of a unified sort of GOP government. I mean, I think the race is a coin flip, frankly, but it's not like they're going to be able to steamroll whatever it is they want through the Congress, because the Congress will still be very, very evenly divided, even if the GOP wins, particularly in the House. So I just think that there's a little bit too much, kind of inflation risk premium baked in from a potential Trump win.
Neil, that final point, a really important one. We'll leave it there. Neil Dutta of Renmark on the US election and on the economic data and the Federal Reserve meeting that we've got to take place on Thursday. Let's keep it there on the US election. Kamala Harris outraising Donald Trump by nearly 5-1 among big donors in the final stages of the campaign. One wealthy individual supporting Harris is Mark Cuban, the minority owner of the Dallas Mavericks, and I'm pleased to say that Mark joins us now. Mark, welcome to the programme. We spoke to a Trump campaign advisor a little bit early this morning, and I want to start with you in a similar way that I started with him, which is basically I'm waking up this morning, I'm a swing state voter, I'm in Pennsylvania state, and I still haven't decided who I'm going to vote for. And I'm thinking back to how Harris talked about in 2019 that she wanted to ban fracking. I understand she's changed her mind, but I'm worried that she's a bit of a shapeshifter. She gets back into power and she'll change her mind again. How do you settle those concerns?
The world has changed since 2019. She's open-minded. She's talked openly about the fact that she wants to give dissenting opinions a place at the table with her. She's not dogmatic. That's how you explain it. And she's looking to put together the best policy. She said in 2020 that she supported fracking. So I think that's a non-issue. And in terms of, is she just an extension of Biden? Just look at Biden's budget proposal versus what Kamala Harris has actually proposed. Biden wanted much higher taxes. Kamala Harris came in at 28% for tax rate for cap gains and 28% for corporation, and did not say a word and will not say a word about unrealized capital gains. And so I think she's completely different. She's not a shapeshifter in the least bit.
Well, that individual we were speaking to, Scott Bessent, this key economic policy advisor to the Trump campaign, says that Harris, what he hears from a lot of Wall Street journals, that she would be moderated by a Republican Senate. And that's why Wall Street would be willing to vote for her, because of that moderating effect that she would get from a red Senate. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, balance is not a bad thing necessarily. I'm not opposed to a divided Congress. But the bottom line is, what will Kamala Harris do? And I think she's better for the economy in so many ways. There's 335 million people in this country. 4 million make $400,000 or more. The other 330 million make less. And she's been very specific that if you make $400,000 or less, your taxes aren't going up. In fact, for 100 million people, they're going down. The other big expense that every household is fearful of is healthcare expenses. Donald Trump has said he has a concept of a plan. Kamala Harris has been very specific on the pharmaceutical side, saying she's going after the pharmacy benefit managers, the middlemen, and she'll introduce transparency. I know from my own personal experiences with cost-plus drugs, that'll lead to a 20-30% or more deduction in the cost of medications for households and businesses. And then you've got tariffs. As Michael, I think it was, said earlier, tariffs are a bad idea. I mean,
well, if they're so bad, then why did Biden and Kamala Harris keep them? They keep the Trump-era
Well, let's talk about that, right? Because that's not completely accurate. First, look at the EU. Biden signed a deal saying that there would be no tariffs between the two, EU and the United States, for the next 5 years. So those tariffs are gone. And then you look at what Trump tried to introduce. He had 4 years to try to implement tariffs that worked, and he got his butt kicked by China. The retaliatory tariffs almost destroyed the soybean and the farming industry, and he had to pay out $20 million. But as it applies to households, right? He's talking about a 60% across the board tariffs for Chinese imports. China makes just about every Christmas present that we buy for our kids. So families would be looking at a 60% or more increase in what they'd spend on Christmas. And the downstream impact of that would be significant to small and large businesses.
Mark, let's talk about something you've been very vocal on. This is regulation. You've said that you don't think Harris should keep Lina Khan, the head of the FTC, on. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from New York, went to Twitter and she said billionaires like you, Mark, are trying to play footsie with the ticket. And if anyone goes near Lina Khan, there will be, quote, an out-and-out brawl. Where is Harris when it comes to things like the FTC?
I don't know. I haven't talked about personnel with her or her team. I have no intention about talking about personnel. You know, I was asked a question about what I thought about the FTC, and I thought that, you know, the possibility of breaking up the big technology companies would be a negative, because I think, you know, winning the AI battle for the United States is paramount from a military and an economic perspective. So I voiced my opinion, but I'm not involved in those conversations at all.
But it really raises this ultimate question, which is what policies will she follow? She's been engaging with AOC quite a bit in terms of the campaign trail. And there's a real question of how much there will be an effort to cater to the further left sides of the Democratic wing versus the sort of centrist appeal that she's been trying to have. How much are you actually getting confidence that she's going to have business executives in cabinet positions, in top areas where she really is listening to what they have to say?
I talk to her campaign almost every day. I'm 100% certain. I'm not just confident. I'm certain that that's what they're going to do. I've been on the trail with Doug Emhoff, who, as part of his presentation, talks about what a capitalist she is. She's talked about, you know, wanting to create 25 million new businesses. That's not a reflection of anything far left. She, one of the first things she did was introduce a tax deduction or increase the tax deduction for startup costs to $50,000. That's very important. She recognizes that of the 33 million companies in this country, 99% are passed through, 99% are run by people making $400K or less. Those small businesses are what drive the economy. They create most of the new jobs every single year. So she's focused on an opportunity economy. I don't think she can be any more clear.
Mark, do you think that this campaign for Kamala Harris could have done more to reach out to the male voter? This seems to be an election that is unique in just how bifurcated the male and the female vote really has been. There were some questions around Joe Rogan and how to appeal to the male vote and how to really bring the genders together. What's your take on this campaign's approach to that?
I think it was very data-driven. I mean, women have a higher propensity of voting, and, you know, with reproductive rights and other issues that were geared towards women, I think she did a great job of connecting to them. You know, maybe she didn't do everything she could have with men, but that's okay, because she went to the people who are going to vote more. You go, you know, as a business person, you go to the people you have the best opportunity to sell to. Who's going to buy your product? Who's going to vote for you in this particular case? And the fact that she's only been in the race 14 weeks and she's caught up completely, and now I believe passed her and will win today, I think she's done the exact right thing.
Mark, speaking of business and product, there's a famous quote from Michael Jordan, which I'm sure you know well. Republicans buy sneakers too. It raises a question about you, and I wanted to ask you about this. For a man who's got a line of businesses, why was this important to you to put your name and reputation on the line and really get deep into politics when ultimately Republicans buy sneakers too?
So I'm not going to get deep into politics, but I think this, you know, this is a close election for a reason. And I think Kamala Harris will be the United States of America. And that's the only reason I'm doing this.
Well, thank you for sharing your time with us this morning. We appreciate it, Mark, and hopefully we can catch up again soon. Mark Cuban there on the latest campaign effort from the Harris campaign.
Yeah, I really think he's the politics. Well, he's not a politician, but he is deep into politics. I mean, he is one of their biggest surrogates on the Harris campaign, and he's spending a lot of time and a lot of money trying to get her elected.
Certainly deep into campaigning. Your thoughts on your question and the answer you got to it about the male vote?
Well, following the numbers, the fact that women vote more than men, which is something that a lot of people have been talking about and leaning into, I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that there is a reckoning after this election about how divided male and female voters really are in this country. In fact, has been unprecedented.
I think we all share that view. If you are just joining us, equity futures on the S&P up by 0.2%, with an update on stories elsewhere this morning. With your Bloomberg brief, let's cross over to Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John, a check on Palantir shares this morning, up 17% pre-market. It reported quarterly revenue that beat analyst estimates. It also raised its forecast for operating income in the current period. It cited higher demand in the U.S. for its AI software. Shares of Palantir are up 140% so far this year. Apple is exploring a push into smart glasses, setting the stage for the company to compete with Meta. According to people with knowledge of the matter, the tech giant began an internal study codenamed Atlas last week, which involved gathering feedback from Apple employees on smart glasses. More focus groups are planned for the near future. Meanwhile, shares of Wynn, those are falling 2% pre-market. The casino operator reported adjusted EPS for the third quarter that missed the average estimate. That was largely driven by the company's operations in Macau. Profits there were 10% below expectations. Wynn also said it had approved a buyback of up to 1 billion shares. The company's CEO saying that the results reflect healthy demand across its resorts. And that's your Bloomberg brief. John.
Hey, Danny, thank you. And welcome to the programme to all of you. If you are just joining us, equity futures right now on the S&P 500 up by 0.2%. Just a flavour of the bond market for you. Yields are higher by more than 4 basis points now on a 10-year 432. Some important economic data about an hour from now. You get a PMI in the United States. Then 15 minutes after that, an ISM services read in America, which I keep saying, Lisa, and I know you agree, that's an important data point for this economy and for this market.
It has been the pillar that has really been holding up a lot of the engine of growth. It has not been in the manufacturing sector, which has been in recession. Key question, can you see that expansion continue at a time where we heard from Kelsey Barrow, we heard also from Veronica Clark over at Morgan Stanley. There is a real, over at Citigroup, there's a real question about just how much momentum is in this economy.
Up next on the programme, we'll set you up for the day ahead, a very long day, and a week ahead, and maybe the month ahead, and we'll take you back to both candidates' headquarters as Election Day gets underway.
There are many global investors that aren't interested in China anymore, but there's a lot that are. And obviously the local investors have money in China and are doubling down on investing in China. Many of the Asian investors, and in fact a lot of the Middle East investors, the Americans are gone away. Therefore, there's an amazing opportunity to put capital to work and get returns which are excess what you would get in other places. Where there is lack of money, there is usually opportunity. So we continue to build out our business in China. It's just where the money's coming from is different. And so we're raising local money in China for investing and bringing those that choose to be there to invest in China. So it's just a different, where the money's coming from is just different.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
We thought we'd take a look at Bitcoin versus the S&P 500.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
A tectonic shift emanating from Washington.
It's really a tale of two cities in crypto.
Crypto shouldn't be partisan.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Crypto VC is back.
And the technology.
It's really the beginning of a global on-chain economy.
And if America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be left behind.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
Good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Welcome back to the opening trade.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
This is the Asia Trade.
You're watching The Close.
Welcome to Balance of Power.
This is Bloomberg.
Bringing you up-to-the-minute financial news whenever and wherever it happens. I'm Michael McKee at the Federal Reserve, and this is Bloomberg.
"42 minutes until the opening bell, with equity futures up by 0.2%, yields higher by 4 basis points, the 10-year 432.31. As we count you down to the opening bell, here's the trading diary for the rest of this week. Today, the US presidential election, plus US PMI data. Thursday, the Fed rate decision and another round of jobless claims, plus a rate decision from the BOE. And on Friday, if you're still around for this, UMich consumer sentiment data on Friday morning. Can you imagine being around for that?
10 a.m. I'm going to be sitting at my desk.
I'll still be waiting for numbers from Pennsylvania.
Exactly.
On Friday.
Aren't we going to get the ultimate consumer data when we find out the results of this election?
Yeah, nothing else matters after that, that's for sure. Let's turn back to the top story, Election Day in America. Our team coverage of the Trump and Harris campaigns for a final word. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall in Florida, Skylar Woodhouse in Washington. Tyler, first to you. Walk us through the former president's day ahead of him.
Yeah, hey, John. So right now we are waiting to get inside the Palm Beach Convention Center. Security is incredibly high here. Secret Service doing their sweeps before former President Donald Trump arrives for his election night watch party tonight. But before those results, before that watch party, this election could really come down to which candidate did a better job of convincing Americans that they are best for the economy. When we talk about Trump's closing arguments, we saw him on the campaign trail yesterday doing what he calls his signature weave, but also at the same time trying to hammer home his own economic vision. For example, just yesterday, introducing a new threat of heightened tariffs against Mexico. So clearly trying to capitalize on this sentiment that we're seeing, that despite some recent bright spots and economic indicators, the economy remains the top issue for voters. And our Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling shows us that former President Donald Trump is currently leading Vice President Kamala Harris when it comes to voter confidence on the economy by about 5 percentage points. It is important to note, though, that in that same poll when he was running against President Biden, that gap was 14 percentage points. So clear that Vice President Kamala Harris has made some inroads when it comes to this issue, but that former President Donald Trump clearly holds the edge still when it comes to the economy.
Skylar, last night we saw the vice president physically knocking on doors in Pennsylvania, basically asking people for their votes in these final moments. What's she doing today?
The vice president is hunkered down here in D.C. today. She's at her residence at the Naval Observatory. For the pool, the call time is not until this afternoon. And what we know is that she will be doing media rounds with radio stations across all 7 swing states. So she is still out there, doing the media rounds, trying to connect with those last-minute voters in those key battlegrounds. But she, for the most part, will be hunkered down today, and we most likely won't see her until the election night festivities at Howard University, her alma mater. But the campaign really has been only in this race for a little bit more than 100 days. And last night, one of her senior campaign officials said that they are confident that Vice President Harris will win all 7 battlegrounds, and that was coming from David Plouffe, who ran Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. And that is, potentially some wishful thinking, but I think one thing the campaign has done, that they've struck this balance, and even Harris has said it herself, that they are the underdogs, but they have a lot of momentum. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that momentum does play out with the first poll set to close in less than 12 hours. And I think that, we will see from the campaign how that momentum really plays out.
Tyler, what are you looking for in terms of what the Trump camp wants to see before they either declare victory or potentially sort of cede the election?
Right, exactly. So in recent days leading up to this, we've seen former President Donald Trump tell his supporters that this is their election to lose, despite all of the polls showing us that this is going to be an incredibly close race. That sort of rhetoric is raising concerns that he might contest the election results before they are even called, or if they are not called in his favor. It's important to point out that Trump and his allies filed at least 60 different lawsuits in the wake of the 2020 elections. Both sides of the aisle are gearing up for any potential litigation. When it comes to this, we know the RNC as well as the DNC has been fundraising heavily, raising millions of dollars for any potential battles. And I would just quickly point you to a recent Bloomberg News analysis, which found that 165 lawsuits were filed between 2023 and today, Election Day, on everything from mail-in ballots to early voting. So it does appear that both sides could be gearing up for a potential litigation fight going into this week.
Expect and brace for more of that later on this evening. Tyler Kendall, Skylar Woodhouse, to the both of you, thank you. Special coverage later on this evening. Election night 2024, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on Bloomberg TV. The Bloomberg team at the election map, Katie Lyons, following the House and Senate races, Joe Matthew. On the markets, Lisa, Danny Berger and Anne-Marie, trying to keep us all awake a little bit later.
Yeah, all awake for this evening and then potentially the rest of the week. You know, Tyler there was talking about the #1 issue being the economy, which it has been the entire year. This ranks far and large the biggest issue hitting voters. But then we got this poll over the weekend from Iowa. And this poll came after this summer Iowa put in one of the most strictest abortion bans we see across the nation. It's 6 weeks. And then you saw this uptick of women going out to vote. And not just young women, women 65 and over. Women who remember when Roe was stated, and now we remember who Dobbs when Roe was taken back. And you can think that this is about the economy, but there is this potential that these pollsters are underestimating the fact that more women are going to be going to the polls because of abortion. And you saw that in that poll. Remains to be seen whether or not that's going to be a harbinger, foreshadowing what could potentially happen, if there's a pink wave or not. If it's the economy, certainly DJT has the upper hand.
There's an analogy between some of these political polls and some of the results we're getting in and the economic data. In terms of there are so many different stories behind each person, each industry, each area. The fact that Romaine said that in Michigan, it is foreign policy. It is some of the Muslim communities as well as some of the Polish communities where you hear about the economy in some places and in other places it's things like abortion. What I am struck by is how everyone has a unique story and has their own community that they forged online or whatever, and how it's so difficult to speak about any of this in some sort of overarching average.
2016, 2020, these polls are won on the margins. Biden won the blue wall with just 77,000 votes. You have to make sure you are going laser sharp into these different groups, which is why when you have maybe an unforced error talking that saying Puerto Rico is an island of garbage, that could hurt you in a place like Pennsylvania, where there's some 500,000 Puerto Ricans living, and maybe some of them are going to go to vote after hearing that.
Let's wrap it up. I need to go to bed, and then I'll see you again at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Coming up tomorrow, we'll still be awake. Anastasia Amoroso of iCapital, Mohammed Al-Erin of Queen's College, Cambridge, former Kansas City Fed President Thomas Hoenig, and Torsten Slok of Apollo. From New York City, that does it for us this morning. We'll see you later on this evening for special coverage of Election Night 2024. With equity futures on the S&P 500 firmer by 0.2%. That does it for us. Thank you for choosing Bloomberg TV. This was Bloomberg Surveillance.
Morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. markets close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time, only on Bloomberg Television.
To succeed in Wall Street, what skills do you need? You need to be somebody that claws people on the back, people that you have to be tough, you have to be fighting people all the time. What are the skills that really take to succeed in Wall Street?
Great question. Of course, you have to work hard. So I can tell you what I found for me, and it's probably counterintuitive. I had to stick out, which is interesting because I made the decision earlier. Being really the only woman, I already stuck out, and I thought I might as well double down on that. I can't hide. So how did I do that? It was by being a contrarian. And I refused as a research analyst to ever publish research reports that said me too. That said, oh, IBM reported earnings, they came in 2 cents ahead. One of the pennies was currency, the other penny was lower G&A, blah, blah. Forget it. Big calls on big stocks. My very first piece of research I published was very negative at a time nobody did it. I stood the heck out. And when I was right, that elevated me. And David, I've done that as a research analyst, but I did it in business as well. Here's a business strategy. If everything's fine, just keep your head down and execute. Every once in a while, you have a big insight, and you can build an entire business, in fact, an entire industry around it.
Why does this business model work? Because it's virgin space. It's never been done before, and it'll never be done again. When you step back and you look at something that's been golf through institutions, has been the way it has been for 53 years without change. In 1993, I stepped back and said, okay, this is not right. It's doing the same old Groundhog Day. Everything's the same. Players are a pass-through entity. They're not getting any equity built in their day. Once they're done playing, they're out. I thought, that's just not right. When you have to build a sustainable model, you need to have these players, these famous, the world best, the best of the best. You need to give them equity into the future. You need to give them a vision of where they need to go and how they're going to get there.
It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg.
Today's the day. 30 minutes until the start of cash trading on this election day. I'm Matt Miller.
I'm Shonali Bassett.
And I'm Katie Greifeld. Bloomberg Open Interest starts right now.
And coming up today is the day. Election day is finally here. Harris and Trump end one of the most dramatic presidential campaigns in history. It's now down to the voter to decide the winners.
From key market signals to key races to watch, we've got team coverage for you from around the country, as well as reaction from Wall Street and the C-suite.
Plus, Boeing finally reaches a deal with its union workers, ending a strike that's crippled production for almost 2 months. Some needed good news for Boeing. We'll get to all of that and more, but let's take a look at where markets are trading, of course, as we count down to when polls close. You can see the setup right now, it's pretty tepid. The S&P 500 up about 0.1%. The NASDAQ 100, your big tech names, up a little bit more. It's hard to make too much out of these moves, of course, as we await for some clarity here. Hopefully, we'll get it in the next 24 hours or so. You take your look at the bond market right now. A wild day yesterday, a big rally, and now coming back up a little bit. You can see 10-year yields currently higher by about 4 basis points, Matt.
All right, so equity index is still near all-time highs. We've done pretty well after the past couple of presidential elections as well. I've got a chart here that shows the results in equity indexes 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 quarter, and 1 year after. You can see, though, that 2016, for some reason here in yellow, I would have put it in red, 2020 in white, I would have said blue, but 2020 was a better year, or the year following the election, for the equity markets than the year following the 2016 election. The same is true, that was the S&P. The same is true for the NASDAQ, as well as for the Russell 2000. So regardless of where you look, we had a better year following the 2020 election than we did following the 2016 election.
Optimism all around, Matthew. This is what we depend on you for. We're going to look at some stocks to watch under the surface. Optimism in Boeing, of course, as Katie was talking about, 1.7% higher. Workers voted to accept a new labor contract, ending a strike that crippled the jetliner's production. Of course, Boeing still down on the year pretty significantly, but a good day for them indeed. Palantir just soaring more than 16.5%, climbing after reporting record profit on strong demand for AI products. Palantir has already been up 141% this year, so adding to those gains in a big way. Ferrari, though, down 5.7% lower after shipments of luxury cars declined in the third quarter, Matt.
All right, and Of course, there's a lot to talk about other than the election.
Well, it's your birthday.
No, it is my
#1.
birthday, and really, we wouldn't have had anything to talk about other than the election,
True.
but Boeing workers came back from strike
They
yesterday. You must
did.
be so excited.
I'm sure that Kelly Ortberg is pretty excited here, too. Maybe the Biden administration. We know that, of course, Julie Su has been involved in those talks. Let's talk about the election, though.
Okay.
I mean, we've been drumbeating for months and months. We're finally here. And it was Cameron Dawson, actually. She made a good point on surveillance earlier that you think about how close polls are, 50-50. Any surprise, any outcome is going to be a little bit of a shock.
And with the economy being such a hot topic on people's radars, we have to remember that in those swing states, the economic realities are different on the ground. You know, guys, in Nevada and Michigan, the jobless rate is actually higher than the national average. So it will be interesting to see who comes out to the polls, who they vote for with those realities in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's continue to focus on this election coverage, shall we?
Yeah.
I mean, why not? What else are we going to talk about today,
we could talk
right?
about earnings, we could talk about the Fed. We're going to get to all of that, but we have reporters stationed across the country right now from all the swing states, from both campaign headquarters. Let's get to it now with Bloomberg's Skylar Woodhouse. She's been following the Harris campaign in Washington. We also have Philippe Marquez with the Trump campaign in Florida. Skylar, we're going to start with you on the Harris campaign. Of course, you've been following it closely over the past couple months, and she's only been in the race since July. Talk to us about the culmination and how Kamala Harris and her team will be spending the last few hours here.
So Vice President Kamala Harris, she is hunkered down here in Washington. She got back to D.C. early in the morning after her final rally in Philadelphia. She was barnstorming Pennsylvania all day yesterday to try and shore up those final votes in the must-win battleground for the return to the White House. And she is here in D.C. today. She will be hosting her election night festivities at Howard University. And, you know, I think the campaign, like you just said, they haven't had a ton of time with specifically Harris. Now, they were on board for Biden, but since Harris has taken over, they've really had to hit the ground running, from, you know, mobilizing voters to learn who Vice President Kamala Harris is as she stands as her own candidate. And so, you know, that will all come together tonight. As polls close, we'll see where the results come in. But, you know, I think that the campaign is feeling the momentum. We've heard from top Harris advisors who have said, you know, that they are pretty confident that they'll get the win. Some even saying that Harris could potentially win all 7 swing states. Now that's wishful thinking, but we will see how the results turn out. I mean, I just want to highlight here the Des Moines, Iowa poll from over the weekend shows Harris up 3 percentage points. And even on some other national polls, former President Donald Trump is losing the edge he did have in the earlier marks of the campaign. So the Harris campaign is definitely seeing things maybe looking positive, but they have been striking a balance of continuing to say we are the underdogs and knowing that it's still going to be a tough battle.
Felipe, let's bring you in here as well. What is the tone on the ground at the Trump campaign?
Well, first of all, as you can see, I have this very dreary background in front of me. No palm trees, nothing that would suggest that I'm in Palm Beach. But it's because we can't be at the convention center right now. It's getting ready for tonight's big party. I mean, it's striking the difference between what Skylar just described, right? Like, I spent the night talking to a couple of Republican operatives, and they are sure that Donald Trump's going to win. They say that early voting data points out that he has a large margin for victory. They're very optimistic. They were very energized by Joe Rogan's endorsement last night. They think the Iowa poll was a fluke. I mean, so obviously they are very, very optimistic with their chances. There's still one very important thing left for Donald Trump to do today, which is cast his own ballot. He's expected to do it by late this morning, and then he leaves to Mar-a-Lago, where he's going to host a couple tele-rallies. So for tonight's big event, we're going to do it at the West Palm Beach Convention Center. Trump's going to spend most of his time in Mar-a-Lago. So there's going to be the convention center, a VIP area at the convention center, and even more the VIP area at Mar-a-Lago. But to be in Mar-a-Lago, you have to be part of his inner circle or have a membership. Remember that now memberships are at 1 million each as of October. So I guess that's going to be probably the very top of his donors and advisors.
All right, Felipe, thanks very much for joining us. Felipe Marquez there in Palm Beach, Skylar Woodhouse in Washington, D.C. I want to get to our guest right now, Bridgewater Associates former chief investment strategist Rebecca Patterson, here with us on set. Rebecca, you have suggested in the past that Trump threatens the foundations of America's economy and power, and I wonder if the $27 trillion bond market doesn't offer some checks and balances here. I mean, can't the bond vigilantes do something in order to, you know, save a worst-case scenario?
I mean, I think our bond market, to your point, $27 trillion is too big for even the biggest traders out there to move the market. But I think it is interesting when you look at former President Trump's policies. They've been estimated by a variety of nonpartisan sources to be relatively more inflationary. So that, all else equal, is going to push up the curve. But secondly, the tariff policies are likely to be inflationary. And then immigration, if he follows through. And all campaign proposals are ifs, right?
Especially on such an incredibly difficult and
Correct.
expensive
Correct.
undertaking. I mean, even with the funding, how would you do it?
Let's say, though, you have a modest number of immigrants going out. The Peterson Institute said if you have 1.3 immigrants leaving, you have the 10% global, 60% China tariffs. Those two things together could lift CPI by 4 percentage points. So you've got the inflation picture. Then supply, if we have these tax cuts, we're going to push up bond supply significantly. And then demand. You know, we're getting about a quarter of demand from foreign investors. If we're putting tariffs on all these foreign investors, are they going to want to continue at the same rate or greater to buy bonds? So I do think there's a risk higher for bond yields on the back of this compendium of Trump policies, if you will. But we'll see. Again, just because you propose it doesn't mean it becomes reality.
And I have a question about the funding. Right now, I think you wrote that 60% of foreign banks' holdings are in treasuries.
Correct.
If they even marginally change that, it would make a huge difference. What asset would they go to? Would they go to euro? Would they go to UN?
Right. So this is what's saving the Treasury market, frankly, over the last several years, is there isn't a great alternative. Investors, especially central bank investors, care about liquidity. They care about transaction cost safety. And there is nothing like the U.S. Treasury market. However, it's a structural risk. If these tariffs are going on, we're not as close with our allies. They are going to see, where else can I go? The biggest one we've seen in the last few years, which you all talk about well and regularly, is gold. You know, China, Russia, a number of emerging market central banks in particular have been adding to their gold reserves in recent years, which is largely why gold is near a record high.
I want to talk a little bit more about the bond market. I want to talk about the action that we've seen so far, because you think about since the end of September, we've seen this fantastic run-up in bond yields, a fantastic run-up in the dollar as well, to bring it to currencies. A lot of people have ascribed that to the Trump trade, basically, to Trump's odds of winning. And just to blueprint out a little bit here, if we were to see a Trump victory, how much do you think that it's already priced into these markets?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know exactly to quantify it, but I do think you can say there's some probability of a Trump victory being priced into markets here with the dollar and with treasuries. But thinking about the dollar in particular, you know, the dollar has been rising under the Biden administration too. So it's a big question is what's driving these moves. If you have a Trump or a Harris victory and there's more fiscal stimulus, that can lift the long end of the curve, growth, reflation hopes. If you have a strong U.S. economy and supported equity markets, foreign capital coming into the U.S. can lift the dollar. That's been the story the last few years under a Democrat. So even if Harris wins, and the chances are good, it's so close, I don't necessarily think that means a sustained weaker dollar or sustained lower yields. I think it's a question of degrees, and there's going to be some volatility in the interim.
Rebecca, so much of these policies come down to Congress as well, and especially when you look at the House. It's pretty incredible how tight some of these races are, and the chances that you may not get a red sweep in the House. So what would that mean in terms of the ability to extend fiscal dominance, even if Trump does win?
Right, and I think this is such a great question because investors sometimes focus on a policy, and you need to understand when can the policy get passed, what's the probability of its passage, how impactful is it? So we know, sweep or no sweep, you can do trade, you can do a lot of regulatory, you can do immigration. So if Trump wins, that's likely to happen Jan 2021, right, or get started. The fiscal could take a little longer. Obviously, it has to happen in 2025. If you don't have a sweep for former President Trump, He's still likely to get a lot through, but it's a question for either Harris or Trump how much they could get through in a divided Congress, especially with our budget deficit now closer to 6% of GDP and debt closer to 100% of GDP. There's going to be a lot of pushback. And don't forget, we have debt ceiling, right? Jan 1, we hit the debt ceiling. It'll get extended to late spring or summer, but that's going to be a lever in this political fight that I'm afraid we're also going to be facing next year, whoever wins.
All right, Rebecca, we are just getting started. Stick with us. That is Rebecca Patterson helping us kick off our Election Day coverage. And tonight on Bloomberg, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons will have a 2-hour Balance of Power special to kick off our election night coverage. That's followed by Bloomberg's Election 2024 special beginning at 7 p.m. in New York. This is Bloomberg.
Morning, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Tom Mackenzie in London. These are the stories that set your agenda.
Taking you from the U.S. markets close to the overnight session in Asia. We'll walk you through what you need to know to kickstart the European trading day. Live from our European headquarters, we bring you the day's top market-moving stories, unmatched expert analysis, and on-the-ground reporting from across the continent. Tune in every weekday at 6 a.m. London time, only on Bloomberg Television.
In case you missed it, on Bloomberg Technology.
We're excited to really change the expectations for space companies, where you have this always-on, reliable, and frankly dynamic satellite connectivity that you would expect of your power grid or of your cell phones. And so we think that this is a huge opportunity space, and our first contribution to it is through shared infrastructure.
You can see this whole ecosystem developing, and you have an exponential growth right now because easier access to space means more demand for space, and that's the definition of an exponential growth function. So if you think about someone like Varda, who is only possible now because access to space is cheaper and easier, we're demanding more access to space.
I think that's what's so exciting from a business perspective, is the fact that if you can do it, you're one of the few numbers of organizations in the history who've actually pulled it off. And so it creates a very defensible position, because again, space is very, very hard.
Don't miss Bloomberg Technology live every weekday.
Bloomberg loves earnings.
I know it's like your Super Bowl, right?
I can't wait. It's like opening presents in the morning.
All right, it will be exciting.
Nobody covers earnings like Bloomberg. Bloomberg Surveillance covers the latest in global markets and the political events that influence your world. Join Jonathan Farrell, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern only on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
And we're back with Rebecca Patterson. She's the former Bridgewater chief investment strategist. Where we left off was the policies that could matter next year in the case of a Trump win or a Harris win. And in the case of a Trump win, you are one of the people that have said you're worried about the course of inflation, the trajectory here. And the market still has, through the end of next year, almost 120 basis points worth of rate cuts.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, the good news is the Fed is able to bring rates down, even though the economy is pretty strong. So that's kind of Goldilocks, right? We're getting lower cost of capital and a fairly resilient economy. Q3 was around 2.8%. That's great for the stock market, for risk assets. The question to me with the election is next year, not the move this week or in December. But if we have about 90 basis points of cuts priced in for next year, and inflation starts ticking up, inflation expectations tick up on the back of some of the policies and policy proposals, the Fed might not be able to do 90, and that's what the market's discounting. So then for stocks to do well, you need an offset from a strong economy to meet those EPS growth expectations of 14%. We might get it. Like, one thing I wanted to mention, regardless of the fiscal that happens next year, JP Morgan put together an estimate, and I've checked it quickly. I think it's correct. They're expecting just in the next year, the top 7 tech companies spending over $500 billion in CapEx and R&D. I mean, so you think the Chips and Science Act, huge. It was $52 billion. This is $500 billion. So even if current fiscal stimulus is fading a little bit before the next round of whatever, you have this, what I would call, private sector stimulus. And that's going to feed into the economy in lots of different ways and provide another level of support. And I think sometimes investors forget about that. They're focusing on the fiscal because of the election, but there's also this private sector momentum, especially from tech, that's pretty significant.
Well, and that tracks with Facebook saying they're going to spend, what, $98 billion? Microsoft renting a nuclear power plant?
Yes.
I mean...
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up tech because it's often lost in these conversations. And I want to talk a little bit more sector specific because you think about Trump's tariff proposals, for example. We focus on China, but he's promised a 10 to 20% tariff on all imported goods, not just Chinese imported goods. And you think about clothing, for example. Apparently 97% of clothing sold in the U.S. is imported. So if you think about sector effects, I mean, which industry stands to potentially be hit the hardest here?
I mean, I'm nervous, very nervous about agriculture in the United States if the tariffs go ahead. What we saw in the first term for former President Trump is that that was the bullseye for retaliation. Go after American farmers, go after things that are iconic to America, right? So Harley Davidsons, I think
Levi's, bourbon, yes.
But farmers. And so the government had to give unprecedented subsidies to farmers to try to even things out, but even that didn't help them. And structurally, they lost a lot of market share to Brazil and things like soybeans. So the farm community has never recovered from this. And if we're going after not just China, but a number of countries, the retaliation is going to be a lot bigger than last time, I fear. And that's something that we have to think about in terms of how it hurts the business community, business sentiment, this business investment I just mentioned.
What do you make of tax policy? Because that has a lot to do with animal spirits as well, right? And we see a big difference in Trump's proposed 15%. Kamala's proposed 28% on corporate taxes. Right. It only makes up, I think, 9% of receipts, but it still changes the way you think about doing business. And then, of course, how you and I and Shonali and Katie are affected individually, right?
Right.
It's going to be a big difference.
I mean, the thing to me from Trump's first term versus now, in the first term, we had very large tax cuts, corporate rate going from 35 to 21, and we had relatively small tariffs. This time we have, we'll see how big, what gets through, but smaller tax cuts being proposed and huge tariffs. So the degree of the influence from these two policies, if they get enacted as put forward, the math is going to be different. And remember, in 2017, Trump wins, the market takes off on hopes and then actual confirmation of tax cuts. But then in 18, when the tariffs started, we saw the S&P fall 20% between September and December that year on a combination of the trade war fears and the Fed saying, okay, this fiscal has overheated the economy, we're going to raise rates faster. So if you bought stocks on Inauguration Day 2017, by the end of 18, you made 4%. That's it. It was a round trip. So I think for everybody, it's important not to just think about tax policy or trade policy, but think about all of it together. And then the outside forces, like monetary policy, like China stimulus. If you're going to get your election trade right, you have to be putting it all together.
I was living in Germany, by the way, in 2018, and desperately wanted to buy a Harley Davidson Fat Bob, but it became too expensive for me.
In Tokyo.
And I'm Heidi Stroud-Watts here in Sydney, where the trading day begins. We're here in the center of all the action to get you set up with the numbers, news, and knowledge you need for the day ahead.
The demand is indeed recovering. We've been waiting for this moment.
The opportunity of a century.
Join us on Bloomberg The Asia Trade. Weekdays only on Bloomberg TV. Context changes everything.
Politics to the world of business. Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines deliver news, insight, and analysis live every trading day. Balance of Power live around the world every weekday, only on Bloomberg. It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But
You had 59% of union members voting in favor, and boy, was it painful to get here.
But no defined benefit pension.
No. We knew that there was going to be a lot of daylight there, and they did get some concession there. This is obviously good news for Boeing. A little bit of a reaction in shares, but shares still off about 40% year to date. This is Bloomberg.
We want to make sure that we're exposed to categories that continue to be playing out all over the world.
There is this real momentum from Wall Street.
We are basically deep in the European earnings season.
Take a look at how we're faring when it comes to Asian markets.
Get your fixed income fix. Watch Bloomberg Real Yield every Friday right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Remember the 5th of November. Hopefully no gunpowder, treason, or plot. This is Bloomberg Open Interest. I'm Matt Miller. We are just 15 seconds away from the start of the cash trade on this Election Day 2024. You can see that futures are up mildly, 0.2% on the S&P, about 1/3 on NASDAQ futures right now. We do have Russell futures down, so the small caps not faring quite as well on this day. I wonder how much volume we're going to see. I wonder how much volatility we're going to see because, of course, it's a 50-50 tie right now. No one really knows who's going to win the election, and the differences, at least in policy proposals, are massive. You heard the opening bell down
about 40% year to date, but at least for this morning, Shanali, up about 1%.
And Katie, I'm looking at here perhaps the next national treasure. We're looking at Palantir soaring, reporting second quarter profit just soaring, raising operating income forecast. U.S. commercial revenue expected to climb over 50% this year. Palantir adds another 14% on top of its 141% gain this year. All-time highs today, Matt.
Yeah, all-time highs for Palantir. It's a different story for Ferrari. The luxury car maker is lower after shipments declined in the third quarter. The drop, as you may guess, was led by China. In that region, deliveries slumped 29%. As a result, Ferrari, which has actually tripled in the past 5 years, so it's been up big, is down 6%. Today, 240 million Americans are eligible to vote. Let's take a look at the election trade. For that, we go to Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abby, what do you got?
Well, stocks today, as you all were just talking about, just mildly in the green. But let's take a look at a cross-asset picture since the time, roughly, when VP Kamala Harris entered the race against Donald Trump. So you can see stocks overall higher up about 12%. The fact that it's big tech, maybe a small nod against Donald Trump since he's expected, his administration is expected, potential administration could be negative toward big tech. Invesco Solar ETF up slightly.